Welcome back. I took a little short, unexpected vacation, but I made Thanksgiving for my family, and this ended up being so big, I had to decide if I was going to split it into two, which I am. So you're going to get an episode today, and then you're going to get one midweek this week. Because this week we're talking about the patriarchs of the Abrahamic religions. Now, the patriarchs have impacted the course of lives all over the world, some for literally thousands of years. They've shaped religions, impacted ancient cultures, shaped current cultures, and even started wars. Knowing that the first 5 books of the Bible, or the Pentateuch, were first compromised in its final form during Babylonian captivity, so around 538 BC. We also know that this is somewhere around 800 years after Moses. And Moses was about 400 years after the patriarchs have come and gone. So can we find Joseph and Jacob and Isaac and Abraham in the historical record? I think we can find a couple of them written down and actually located. Welcome to the Occult and the Apocalypse with Kristen, aka Fire Terror Mama, where I tell you what was once widely known about God, spirituality, and you, and how they took that and locked it away. Come with me while I tell you what I've learned from science, religion, cultural beliefs, and mythology to turn the occult and the apocalypse into just the hidden and the revealed. Now, I named them in reverse order, but we're going to go through them from the beginning to the end, okay? So, Abraham was the father of 3 major religions and is revered in others as well. He's the forefather of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but he's the spiritual forefather of them, but he's also reported to be the blood forefather and founder of these religions, okay? Now, Abraham was from a Sumerian city of Ur, which was under Akkadian rule. Now, Ur would later become under Babylonian rule, but that's not really important to the story. Ur was the largest city on the planet at that time, somewhere between 2030 and 1980 BC. Now, the rabbinical timeline has always put Abraham, originally named Abram, between 2000 BC and 1800 BC, having his birth date somewhere around 1960 BC. Then he's 70 when he's called to leave by God. He travels through Canaan and around the desert for some time before having Ishmael at 88 and Isaac at 100. There was a famine in the land at one point, and he decides at this time that he and his wife Sarai, this is before the children were born, and everyone in their house go into Egypt. Now, this is probably somewhere around 1885 to 1880 BC, probably about 10 years or so after leaving home. And this is the first occurrence that we know of Sarai, later Sarah, pretending to be Abram's sister instead of his wife. Now, Abram and Sarai actually find themselves in a bit of a situation on more than one occasion due to this statement of sister versus wife. So, it's something that they did, and we talk about it a little bit later on. It's something that they did in order to try to protect Abram, but it's a little interesting as we get into it. Now, they go into Egypt to escape the famine. From an archaeological perspective, Canaanite and Levantine people in general were included into Egypt and settling in places close to the Nile Delta. Now, this is before Abram's name change, and at this time, his name means exalted father, which is a little ironic because at this time, Abram, who's about 80, is without any children. Now, the pharaoh at the time would have most likely been Senusret II. So this is likely the pharaoh that brought Sarai into his palace and allowed Abram to become rich in servants, camels, and livestock. Now, back at this time, Egypt was ruled under a nomarchy. So the pharaoh would essentially establish governors in all the different areas, but they're not quite the governors of today. They're more like the governors of ancient times, where hereditary monarchs were second only to the king. Now, Sanuset had a nomarch named Kumhotep II, who had the title of being overseer of the eastern desert, and trade under Sanuset II opened up and flourished to the east with the Asiatic and Levantine people. And so this would make Kumhotep II the official that would have told Pharaoh about Sarai's beauty. Now, on Kumhotep II's tomb, there are several depictions of Semite people. One of these depictions shows Abisha the Hyksos, which is the first use of the word Hyksos, beginning the documentation of the powers that would come into play leading up to Moses and the events of the 18th dynasty, including a slow and then complete takeover by the Hyksos in the 13th, 14th, and 15th dynasties, and the separations of the royal families from there. So this depiction of Abisha the Hyksos, he has a Nubian ibex, which is a special type of goat that survives in the Levantine desert. It appears as though he's offering it either to Pharaoh as a gift or this other official. Now, interestingly enough, Abisha's name in Hebrew means my father is a gift. Now, of course, Hebrew wasn't yet in existence at this time. However, the Hyksos were a precursor to Hebrews, so the meaning of the name likely evolved the same way. So Abram is exalted father, and Abisha is my father is a gift. Is it possible that these are one in the same? It's very likely that when documented on the Egyptians' officials' wall, it may have been adapted as closely as possible to its origin. However, Egyptians were known to have trouble misspelling or misnoming people who were of foreign descent. So is it possible that Abisha, Abram, and Abraham are all one and the same? I do think it's significant that this person was documented by the type of offering, the proper name, and the ethnic identity of a specific individual on a wall of a tomb of the official that would have likely dealt with Abram, should the story in the Bible be true. And for this specific person to stand out in a way that the official would want to commemorate it with its afterlife, their afterlife, certainly makes you wonder what type of impact this particular person had on the Egyptian nobility. And knowing that from the Abrahamic account of the situation, it does seem to lend some validity to the possibility that they are the same people, commemorating an actual event from two perspectives. Now, interestingly enough, the Nubian Ibex is an offering that could have been literal and something that Abisha gave to Pharaoh or the official, or it could have been metaphorical. In the area, the specific type of goat meant to be portrayed often portrayed concepts such as resurrection, cycles of rain and drought, and the interplay behind life and death. Interestingly, this concept of telling the ruler that Abram was Sarai's brother and not her husband is particularly interesting because brother-sister marriages were very common in Egypt royalty. It's very well documented in the 18th dynasty, but it seems to have been practiced as far back as to the 12th dynasty. And in that time, princesses of foreign leaders who fell to the pharaoh in some way or dealt closely with the pharaoh in some way would be taken as royal wives, probably to bring some DNA back into the family. And all other captives under these circumstances would have been commoners, would have been concubines, okay? So it would not be out of culture for a man who doesn't want to be harmed to identify his wife as his sister, because he'd be less likely to be killed for his wife. But also, the Egyptians would recognize the sister component if it was actually found out that this was their wife. So it was a relatively good cover. Now, Abisha, the Hyksos, was depicted on the procession of the Amu, which is often translated to Western Asiatic, but may specifically be Canaanite or Amorite. Abisha was considered the leader of the Asiatics, who are called the Amu of Shu. Amu are considered Western Amorites and ancestors to the Hyksos. Now, we don't know much more about Abisha. If only we had a time machine, maybe we could see for ourselves. But we know from the Bible that they certainly liked Abram in the beginning because Pharaoh enriched him. According to the Bible, mayhem and sickness broke out in the palace as punishment for Pharaoh taking Sarai, and she and Abram, 70 and 80 years old now, move out of Egypt at Pharaoh's request and back into the Levant. According to Abram's story, after leaving Egypt, Abraham runs into a little trouble telling Abimelech that Sarah is his sister and not his wife once again. So he does it a second time with a different kingdom, this time of the Canaanites. Now, God intervenes and stops Abimelech from defiling Sarah and gives Abraham a bunch of money and items and servants and sends them away, but not until they make a treaty for a well. These two certainly walk out of a place a lot wealthier than they came in. It's almost like some type of scheme that they're running, setting people up to morally slip and then walking away a little bit richer. Now, Ishmael was born to Hagar, the Egyptian slave of Sarah, and later Sarah has Isaac about when she's 90 and Abraham is 100. Hagar and Ishmael are sent away due to Sarah's envy, and he goes on to father the Ishmaelites. Sarah lives to be 127 years old and then dies. Abraham buys her a cave in Canaan and buries her there. Abraham then actually remarries and has 6 additional children, and his wife is given he and his wife are given the forefather of additional Middle Eastern tribes as well. Now, after Sarah's death, Abraham, now very old, asks a servant to go back to his homeland in northern Mesopotamia to the town of his brother Nahor. He made the servant promise not to bring Isaac with him, and we never quite know why. The servant finds Rebekah from the town where Nahor lived. Rebekah is his brother's granddaughter, and she has a brother named Laban. Now, Rebekah agrees to marry Isaac, and Laban gives his blessing, and they head back to Isaac. He marries her in his mother's tent, and he's said to be happy again for the first time since his mother's death. At 175 years old, Abraham is dead. Isaac is left his inheritance and his birthright, and his 2 eldest sons, Ishmael, the son of Hagar, and Isaac, the son of Sarah, bury him in the cave that Sarah is buried in. Now, Ishmael's line is not as closely followed, but it is listed in the Bible. His mother, who was Egyptian, found him an Egyptian wife. She bore him 12 sons, and they had 12 tribal camps that settled near the eastern border of Egypt and are said to have been hostile to the tribes of the east of them, which would have been tribes that partially stemmed from Abraham through Isaac, his 6 additional children, likely with a Canaanite woman. Hostility. I wonder why they would feel that way. I mean, it's like, talk about having a favorite child, right? Now, Isaac later goes on to have Jacob and Esau. Was born rich and influential. And I'll tell you, he must not have had a whole lot of accomplishments because there's not a whole lot about him in the Bible. In fact, it jumps pretty much straight from the marriage to Rebekah into the birth of the twins, Jacob and Esau. Now, just as a reminder, Isaac was married after Sarah's death and before Abraham's. Sarah was 90 when he was born and 127 when she died. So the earliest he could have married her is when he was about 40, could have married Rebekah. So we missed a whole lot of information before that. Before we get into that, though, there's a story of Isaac and Abrahamic. Now, Abrahamic was a generic name for a Canaanite king at the time. So it's not surprising. It's not surprising that Isaac and Abraham both have interactions with Abrahamic. However, it does seem interesting that Isaac's story seems to mimic Abraham. Now, Isaac and Rebekah have the same scenario with Abrahamic that Sarah and Abraham do, as well as what they have with Pharaoh. Isaac goes to Abrahamic and tells him, stay here, don't go into Egypt, stay in our land. And Isaac lies, and he says Rebekah is his sister, not his wife. Many men are tempted, but Abrahamic figures out that Rebekah is Isaac's wife and confronts Isaac. Now, Isaac admits that he lied, he was afraid he would be killed, and Rebekah would be taken. And Abrahamic makes a public decree protecting Isaac and Rebekah. And Isaac is allowed to plant crops and grow abundantly. And he gets even richer. So rich that the Philistines become jealous. Abrahamic tells Isaac to leave, and Isaac leaves with his wealth and redigs the well that Abraham had dug, which was covered up by the Philistines when Abraham died. After he redigs the wells, Abimelech makes a covenant with Isaac, and essentially it's Abraham's story all over again. Now, the Philistines in the writings of the Hebrews at this time are not likely the actual occupants of the area. It's who they would be identified with later on. But around 1700 BC, there's a 1200-year discrepancy. It actually likely would have been a Minoan or a Phoenician group, and they may or may not have mixed with Canaanite tribes. So, due to Isaac's only one kingly interaction, which is too close to his own father's interactions, and we wouldn't really be able to verify his existence in that capacity. But Isaac was warned by Abimelech not to go into Egypt. In fact, initially, he discouraged Isaac and Rebekah from going there and said, no, stay here. So let's see what might have been going on in Egypt about 100 years after Abraham left. Well, if Isaac were a real person, and we don't have evidence of that, the warning not to go into Egypt right around that time may have been for a good reason. During this time period in Egypt, it's marked with pharaohs with very brief reigns, and Egypt gradually losing control. Egypt, as it was known to the world, was slowly coming apart, likely due to the increasing Hyksos influence, and it was setting up for the future unrest within the 14th and 15th dynasties, which will come into play later. So maybe there is something to it. It was noted that there was a famine in Isaac's lifetime. However, it's not clear if this is the famine where Isaac lives amongst the Philistines. Now, Isaac is 60 when Rebekah gives birth to the twins. After growing up, Jacob tricks Esau out of his birthright. Kind of sneaky, right? So I'll be honest with you, this portion of Genesis isn't my favorite. There's a lot of lies, favoritism, deceit, theft, and it's all within this kind of twisted little family. And you'll have to realize that Abraham's life actually crossed 15 years into the life of his grandsons, Jacob and Esau, because Isaac was 60 when they were born and 75 when Abraham died. Is it possible that Abraham and Isaac were real people with real lived experiences that were documented by their descendants, and they felt completely compelled to keep the oral history, telling their stories over and over while living in Egypt, and writing it down 1400 years after it began? Well, I'll leave you to think about that. And while you do, think about Abisha, the Semitic trader who is pointed out on a wall of the same official that would have had contact with Abram if he were, in fact, a real person. While imagining that it may have been like these individuals going through these things, also take the time to reflect on the actions taken by these men. Sometimes honorable, other times not so much. Reflect on how literal this portion of Genesis really is when it comes to a family history, and how little it really has to do with God and connection to God. Although God does make appearances here, It's not the primary focus. And now, later this week, we're going to talk about Jacob and Joseph and a little bit of the history of the region and where these things are documented. And I have found at least one more. So, in the meantime, thank you for exploring this little corner of history with me. And thank you for helping me bring the occult and the apocalypse into just the hidden and the revealed. If you come back in 3 days, you will get the rest of the story. And otherwise, I look forward to seeing you soon.